Okay, thanks. I That's the first time I've ever gotten a weather report as part of the introduction. It's like expected to get warmer in here. A chance of rain though, so be careful. Um, yeah, I'm Kevin Patton, and I want to introduce a couple of things before we actually get started here. One is all of you have seen TED Talks, right? And you know how fantastic most of them are. And this talk is not going to be like that, except for one thing, and that's where they take some really big question or some really big idea and smoosh it down into a very short presentation. And so what I'm going to be talking about is really big. I mean, we could be talking for days and days about what kinds of features could go into a textbook and how they can help learning and start, bouncing ideas off each other and grow those ideas. But we only have an hour. And so we're just going to, I'm going to skim over the surface, and we'll have some time, I hope, at the end for some interaction. And we can, maybe this will generate some ideas in you. You can throw them out. Maybe you're already coming in with some ideas. And I'm going to give you homework at the end, so now's a good time to leave if you're afraid of that. And the other thing I want to mention before we get started is not only is this going to be just, the tip of the iceberg, but also I want to give you a little context about what I do, because I'm going to be talking about examples of things I've done in my books, and you need to know what kind of books they are. First of all, I have several textbooks. I teach in human anatomy and physiology, and the typical undergraduate human anatomy and physiology course goes for 2 semesters. So I have what I call the big book, and that's the 2-semester book. And then I have several 1-semester versions, because there are programs that have sort of a lighter weight anatomy and physiology course where they need the smaller book. One of them's out there on the table. You can go look at that one. I will occasionally mention in some of my books I have this, and other of my books I have that, but they're all about human anatomy and physiology, and they're for different audiences, different markets, so that's why I'm going to tailor the features to that particular market. So to kind of get started, sort of like a TED Talk, we're going to, take this really huge idea and try to narrow it down a little bit. What's the purpose of a textbook? That's not the topic we're going to talk about, but we're going to start there. I mean, that's a big question, isn't it? What is the purpose of a textbook? And I'm not, don't give anybody a microphone, because we'll spend the rest of the day on that. There's how many different opinions are in here about what the purpose of a textbook is. The opinion that's important, though, is your opinion for your book, for any particular book that you're doing. And so think of that as you're going through this. And I'm going to give you examples of what I do in my field with my books. And it may not fit exactly with what you're doing or what you're planning to do, but it might spark an idea that's related to your discipline or your way of teaching or the kind of book that you're trying to produce. So, I realize that. There actually are a few A&P authors in here, but very few. And the rest of you are all doing other things or planning other things or thinking about other things. So I think if you go way back in the history, like maybe 2 or 3 years, no, maybe longer than that, it was typical for publishers to approach popular professors and say, hey, why don't you take your lecture notes and turn it into a book? And I think that's kind of the classic idea of what a textbook is, right? It's what you teach in class, traditionally a lecture format, and let's put it in a book form. And now I have a textbook. And, those of you that are successful in textbooks these days know that it's got to be more than that. It's got to be the whole learning experience. So yeah, we're basing it on our teaching. We're taking what we're doing in the classroom and putting it into a book. But it's not just the lecture notes. It's not just a written form of our lecture. We need to think about all those other things we do as teachers that are going to be helping students learn, because that's the goal of our textbook, right, is to be a learning tool for students. So thinking of a textbook as a learning experience, what are the kinds of things we can put in there besides the content, besides that written lecture? What are other things that we can do and bring in that are going to facilitate learning in the same way that we facilitate learning? Not necessarily exactly the same way, but with the same idea that we're doing in the classroom as teachers to help students. And so I think one of the first questions that I ask as a teacher when I'm thinking about what am I going to do special in this class for this group of students or for this course if I'm designing a course, what I want to think about is where are the pain points? Where are the points where the students are going to have difficulty in learning? Is it because I have so much information that they're going to have a hard time learning it and retaining it and be able to retrieve it? Yes, in anatomy and physiology, it's traditionally seen to be kind of a weed out course because it's just a fire hose of information. Everything you need to know about how the body is built and how it functions in 2 semesters, and all the other courses that the students that are in anatomy and physiology, we call it A&P for short. Well, I need to always define that because I forget that most people think of that as an old grocery store chain, A&P. But in A&P, I mean, that is considered to be a very rigorous course where we're dumping all this information, and then the students, they go on into like nursing, pre-med, variety of different health careers and so on. And so it's like everything they need to know going into a health career. Gosh, that is a lot of stuff. So for me, that's a big pain point, is how am I going to address this huge volume of information that they really do need to know? But then I know within that information there are particular pain points, how the kidney works. That's always, even teachers have a hard time figuring that out. And there are a few other areas. So you think about in your discipline or the area that your book is covering, where are the pain points? Where are the things that students, they get confused easily or that they have a hard time digesting, and moving on from there. So I think that's a question we need to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the kinds of features that we want to design into our textbook. Of course, that leads to the next question is, okay, well, now that we've identified the pain points, how the kidney functions, what can I do in my book to address some of those pain points? Maybe when I get to kidney function, I want to throw in maybe a sidebar that has an analogy that's helpful for students. Or maybe I want to have some kind of a reference to internet resource that students can go to and work through. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities. And so I can brainstorm about those and then, figure out, well, what's going to work best with my book, the flavor of my book, the vision of my book. And, of course, as we're brainstorming, I think it's a good idea to always think back to, well, if I were in a classroom, how would I deal with that? How do I get my own students past that pain point? How do I help them in that process? And then I think, well, is that something that I can build into my textbook? Is that something that I can create a version of and put it in my textbook? Or is there something I can put in my textbook that's going to help the teacher do that same thing that I'm doing? So, the textbook is for both the teacher and for the student, right? Because the teacher is using it as a teaching tool, the student is using it as a learning tool, and I think we have to think about both when we're creating those features. And then another thing, and I've only started doing this fairly recently because I guess I only became aware of it later in my career of teaching and writing textbooks, and that is there is a rapidly growing area of psychology called learning science. At least some of them call it that, learning science. And learning science has always been around. I mean, way back when I was an undergrad, I did a secondary teaching certificate and so on, and took educational psychology and so on. And I mean, it's been since ancient times that they've had learning science. They just recently started calling it that, but it's like growing rapidly. And something that they're doing that I think all good science should do, and that is they're taking what we all know to be true and going back and actually testing it to see if it's true. And some of it isn't, or at least it's not for most people. And so there's a lot I've learned recently about how people learn, about how I learn things, about how people in general learn things that I can adapt into my textbook or adjust in my textbook to make it a more effective learning tool. And by the way, if you're interested in that area, one of my favorite, and there's a million books being published. There's one just came out last week that looks pretty good. A lot of books being published, but this one is really short, really easy to read. It's called, Understanding How We Learn. I'll pass it around. Understanding How We Learn, and the subtitle is A Visual Guide. So it's not even that much reading. It's got like all these pictures and cartoons in it, because that's learning science tells us that using cartoons helps us learn. And so anyway, I'll pass this around. And there's two really great things about it. One is it's a really good, well, okay, there's three things. I feel like I'm on Monty Python. There's three things. One thing is it's really well done. I mean, it's really clearly explained, and it's meant for everybody. So it's meant for students, it's meant for teachers, it's meant for other educational researchers, and so on. So it's at a level that everybody can access, and it's very clearly put together. Another thing that I like about it is that it's broad, so it's covering some really big areas in learning science right now. So it gives you a good a good overview of the whole area of learning science. I mean, there's a lot more to it than what's in the book, but that'll give you a good starting place. And the third thing I like about it is in every chapter, they have a list of references to the original research and to other resources and so on. So if you're interested in diving in, which I strongly recommend if you're not already doing that, to start doing that and look at that stuff, that's a good starting point to start with it on. Okay, so what can learning science tell us is, the last question I have on the slide. So we can look there and see, well, okay, of all these ideas I've come up with, all the things that I feel we're working in the classroom and so on, what's learning science saying about that? What's a good way to do these strategies? What's the best way to do it for the most students? What are the possible pitfalls of this? Because learning science is telling us, and we already know this, right? Not all students are the same. So that strategy you have that you've used for decades in the classroom that works for most students, but it doesn't work for all students. So what can we do to try and include all students? And maybe we can't include them all, but let's at least think about all of the students and see what we can do. So I think you're all familiar with some of these classic features, that is, features that we've seen for a long time in textbooks. And I purposely didn't use the word old. Like, I don't refer to myself as an old guy. I'm a classic guy. Because a lot of what I learned way back in the olden days really works, and it's still good. And so I don't, I'm using this as kind of a starting point here to start with what's familiar to most of us. But that doesn't mean that these don't work. These are time-tested, proven features that we can have in textbooks. And I think it's important for all of us to always be looking at all of those things that are already out there, because we may be able to adapt that for our book, and that might be the best feature or group of features to put in our book. It need not be some new thing or different thing or crazy thing, eccentric thing to put in there that's going to work in your book. It could be a classic thing. And I enjoy kind of looking at what different people are doing in different disciplines. That's one of the many things I love about TAA, is that it's not all A&P authors in here. We have authors across disciplines, plus other people that are part of the process of producing textbooks. And I learned so much because I can see, like, in what Robert is doing in his books with geography, there are some of those things that I can leverage into what I'm doing in A&P and think, I never thought of that. That is a great, and I've learned a lot from him. He's done a lot of presentations over the years, and I've picked up a lot from him and some of the others of you in the room. And what I'm saying is, look at that, be open to that, that maybe the same old thing doesn't need to be the same old thing, that there are many kinds of things that have already been out there. Maybe not in your discipline, maybe in another discipline. I can say, wow, that's a fresh look on a classic idea. Just as kind of an example of something you might do different, chapter objectives. In my big book, there's a lot of content I have to put in there, and there are a lot of features I want to put in there. And chapter objectives can be important, but as a teacher, I found that having chapter objectives in a textbook was confusing to students. And the reason is that I don't cover all of those objectives. And there are some objectives I have that aren't there. Even I use my own book to teach out of. And I don't teach exactly what's in the book. I mentor a lot of A&P professors, and I tell them, when you're picking a textbook, don't expect it to fit like a glove. It never fits like a glove. It fits like a mitten. So it does the job, but there's a lot of wiggle room in there for your fingers and so on. And that's to allow the teacher to do what they need to do for that course and for that particular group of students. So what I do in the big book is I take the chapter objectives and I put them in the instructor resources online. And I put it in a form that can be copy and pasted. And I do that alongside our discipline organization, Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, has published a set of recommended learning outcomes. And they also say, don't use all of them, just pick the ones you need. And so, each chapter has the associated HAPS learning outcomes there, plus our chapter objectives that we have constructed that complement those, that fit those, so the teacher can go in and pull out all the ones they need and put it in their syllabus. Now the student has something that they really can use. They don't have to worry about, am I wasting my time by studying this when I don't need to be studying this? And what are some things that aren't in this list that I know my teacher is going to ask about, because that's important in this course, because maybe a program that's on campus that those students are going into have requested certain content that isn't traditionally in that course. So that would be an example of taking chapter objectives. Been around forever, right? Not everybody has them in their book, but I have in one of my books, I don't put them in there at all. I let that up to the instructor because there's just so much content in that book that it really works better that way. Now in the one semester books, I go ahead and put them in because it's so basic that everybody's going to be using everything. So same thing with the rest of these. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of variations of these that I'm going to get to later. So then there are some things that haven't been around forever. There are some things that, and still being used, the classics. There are some that maybe we could call contemporary, meaning they haven't been around for a long time, but a lot of people are using them already, and maybe have been for a number of years. So an example would be adaptive learning platforms. Now, that's not in the textbook per se, but it's a feature of the textbook in that it's usually packaged with the textbook. Sometimes, you have no choice but to have it, or sometimes, I think probably most frequently, it's like an optional packaging thing that you can do to either have it with your textbook adoption or not have it. So there are those things. And then there's, so that's something to look at, and talk to your publisher about. And they're very, very expensive to do, so not every book is going to be, the publisher's going to want to invest that much money in doing that. But there might be some less expensive options. It's worth talking about, it's worth thinking about, and the whole idea of brainstorming, right, is to come up with the best idea possible. So we can start out with the idea of adaptive learning platforms, but maybe we can get to something more workable and more affordable for a particular book in a particular market. Digital books have been around for quite a while, and of course we're still, part of why we're here, part of why I'm here is to find out how close are we to being an all digital textbook world. And I don't think, my opinion is that's never going to happen. But, who am I? I've made all kinds of predictions that have not come true. I didn't think St. Louis was going to win the Stanley Cup. Oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? No, I always thought St. Louis was going to win the Stanley Cup this year. But the digital books, they've been around for a long time, and I don't know how many of you actually use them. For a long time, I, had the bookstore, make the digital book available, but I was using my paper book, because that's the real way to use a book, is not with the digital one. And then I start using the digital book a little bit, and I found it's really cool. There are a lot of things you can do with a digital book that you can't do with a paper book. So now I use both, because I like both. But one thing I like about the digital books, especially from the student perspective, is that they can take notes in them, at least most versions of a digital textbook. They can take notes, they can highlight it, make a note on the highlight. And something that I think is really cool, and I have used as a teacher too, is you can share those highlights and notes. So I mentioned I mentor other A&P students in a graduate program, and in my course, I use a digital book, and I make notes, and I share those notes with the students. And I say, this section here, we normally don't teach in an undergraduate course. It's there to illustrate the background or to give context or whatever. So you'll see this in a textbook, but we don't expect students to know, every term in this table. This is to show relationships and to show that there are a million neurotransmitters. You don't need to know all the neurotransmitters, but look, there's 50 that we know of so far, and more coming down the pike. So, that might be something that you want to promote to the users of your textbook and say, look at that. I'm still toying with the idea of, as an author, doing my own notes and making those available to the teachers and maybe to the students. And I can put those things in there, like you may be wondering why I'm showing this view of the heart and not that view of the heart. Well, here's why. Here's why I think that's important. I haven't done that yet. That's just still in the brainstorming mode. But I'm throwing it out there. Maybe one of you want to try that. And let me know how it works. Case studies. We're seeing more and more case studies being incorporated into books because, well, learning science is telling us that if we, start with some applications so that students can see why it's important that we're learning all that information, and then work through it like a puzzle, it kind of gamifies things. That's another thing big in learning science, gamification. You make it kind of a competition. Who can figure out this case? And so case studies, they've been around for a few years. Blogs and podcasts, I don't want to get too far into this, but podcast by definition is just putting audio out there and available for people. So I think a lot of people, when they think of podcasts, they think of, like one of the NPR podcasts or This American Life and different things like that, where you subscribe to it and it's automatically downloaded into your device or whatever, and you listen to it on a regular basis. And that, a lot of podcasts are like that. But what I've done in my books is I have an audio chapter summary. So that's going back to a classic idea of a chapter summary, but I have an audio version of it. So that technically is a podcast, and students download that from their student resources on the website that they have access to with my book. So it's not something they go into a podcast app like Apple Podcasts and sign up for it. It's not available there. But I've seen some other textbooks that have, in my field, that have podcasts like that they can download on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or whatever. So that's an idea to do something like that, a podcast for students, podcasts for teachers, and so on. And I do actually have a podcast for A&P teachers, but it's not linked to my book. It's what we were talking about in that previous session about I want my voice in the ears of as many A&P instructors as possible, so that when my book comes, any of my books comes across their desk, and you say, oh, Kevin, I listen to him all the time. I know him. And at my last A&P, I've only been doing it for about 18 months. And my last A&P conference was a couple of weeks ago. And I had all these people coming up and saying, oh, I knew that was you. I could recognize your voice. And I'm like, cool. That's exactly what I want. And, and have you seen my book? It's right over here at this table. And so, that's another aspect of podcasting. But I'm really talking about using podcasts as a textbook feature here right now. But I always take any opportunity I have to plug my regular podcast. All right, features you may not be thinking of. So here are some things that maybe you have thought of these. So, I'm not claiming to have invented, sliced white bread or anything here. But they're things that are a little bit out of the ordinary. At least I don't see them very often in other books. Now, this is one that actually is a classic that I'm promoting the idea of taking a step further, and that is chunking. We always do chunking when we're teaching or writing a textbook. We have course content, huge course content. We don't take our textbook and start with the first sentence and just go on for hundreds of pages and then, put in our last paragraph and that's it. We subdivided, right? We subdivided into chapters. And we subdivide the chapters into sections. And sometimes we subdivide those sections into subsections. So we already do chunking. We already realize the value of that. If I'm teaching a course, I'm going to break that up into modules. Or sometimes we follow chapters in the book, and use that as our model. So we already do that. And what I'm promoting is the idea of going back and doing it again. Doing it some more. And breaking it down even smaller. Because the learning science is telling us that if we have too massive of chunk of material, that in itself becomes very intimidating. And I know in my area, because the course already comes with a reputation, that's really bad. And then when they come into my course, they've found out that I wrote the book, and that's even more intimidating. Now, to me, I think that's a benefit for the students. It's like in my voice. It's like me talking to you. And they do realize that eventually, but at first they're like, I thought you were going to really expect a lot out of us because you know so much. And I'm like, really? Do you think I was born knowing this much about my topic? No, it took me, 30-something years to get to where I am, and I don't expect that of you. I expect a few months' worth of learning out of you, and I'm going to help you with it. So come on, let's go. And so doing the chunking, I found, has really been helpful. And in my big book, this is um, table of contents from another A&P book, a really, really good A&P book. And it takes the usual way of addressing the topics. And there is a fairly standard way, a standard progress through the topics of human anatomy and physiology that we all pretty much adhere to, maybe a little bit of wiggling around here and there, but we kind of need to do it because that's what the market needs. And so this is, this could be the brief chapter list for my book, except that I've gone in and chunked it some more. And so in my 2-semester book, instead of having 20-something chapters, which is typical, and oh, by the way, some of these slides, I don't expect you to be able to read these things. I put them up there just to show you the idea of it, so don't listen to what I'm saying rather than trying to read those things. But my point is here, we have 29 chapters here. I have 48 chapters here. But if you look at the page, you may not be able to see the page numbers. 1121 starts the last chapter. 1124 starts the last chapter. They're almost exactly the same size book. But here I have much shorter chapters. And instead of, like just 2 or 3 chapters on the nervous system, I have something like 5 or 6 or 7 or I don't know what on the nervous system. So it's taking nervous system is seen as very intimidating by most students, but you break it down into little pieces, it's not so bad, and it's a little bit more manageable in terms of learning. And by the way, one of the pain points as a teacher that I have with my students, and a pain point I have with being a textbook author and with hearing feedback from students and teachers and so on is, and I'm sure you do in your disciplines too, I can't get them to read the book. They never read the book. Or, oh, I went to 4 years of college. I never read a book. I stopped buying them. I didn't read them. Well, why not? Well, there are a number of reasons that is, but one of the reasons is it feels intimidating. You go in there and you have a 75-page chapter on something technical that a student has no idea of. Of course they have no idea. That's why they're taking the course. And so you expect them to sit down and read a 75-page chapter. I can't read some of those chapters in the A&P books. Because even though I really enjoy that topic, it's just too long. I don't want to sit there and read that much technical stuff for that long a period of time. And most students don't know how to read a textbook anyway. They think it's like reading a novel. I'm just going to sit down and start reading. So that's another hurdle that you have. So if you chunk it into smaller pieces, like, oh, this is a 10-page chapter. This is a 15-page chapter. That's not so bad. I can read a chapter, today or tomorrow or whatever. It's always tomorrow. And then we have another kind of feature. Now, word lists have been around, vocabulary, words, and so on. And the first time I proposed this and was talking to some of my colleagues and so on and kind of floating the idea around, one of the bits of feedback that I heard was, well, that's what you do in grade school textbooks. You have a college textbook, right? You don't want to teach like they do in grade school. Yeah, I kind of do. Some serious learning goes on in grade school. And the way we learn as grade schoolers doesn't change fundamentally when we become adults. We just kind of forget how to do it, and we get out of practice of doing it and so on. But in anatomy and physiology, there's been some research over the past few years that shows that one of the best ways to learn human anatomy is with a coloring book. And I remember the first time I saw a coloring book, a friend of mine, I was in college, this friend of mine was at another college, and she showed me her anatomy coloring book, and I'm like, what kind of school are you going to? I'm going to a serious college. We don't have coloring books. And now I know that they've been shown to really be very effective learning tools. The other big thing is modeling clay. In lab, let's build some muscles out of clay and so on, and that is a really effective way to learn muscles and other organs of the body. And so So yeah, word list, that's a grade school thing. So I'm all for it. Let's bring them in here. And what I use the word list for is to introduce the terminology, because in my discipline, they're learning as many or more new words in a different language than if they were taking French class or Spanish class or Russian or whatever. Um, these are Latin-based terms. Sometimes, they have like Greek word parts and all that, but it's basically in Latin. And it's mostly stuff they've never heard of before. So they have to master the language before they can start to understand what it all means. And when you read even a short chapter that's full of foreign words, how much is that going to get you? I mean, how advanced, or how is that going to advance your learning if you don't understand most of the words? Not only that, but as you read them, if you get a word like carbaminohemoglobin, which is the version of your blood that's full of carbon dioxide, but I just love that term, carbaminohemoglobin. It just has kind of, I'm going to write a poem someday about carbaminohemoglobin. But, I mean, it's a long term, and when you first run across that in a sentence and you've never seen it before, it's a stumbling block. So that nice flow you had in this, wonderfully crafted text that you're reading, and all of a sudden, you're at a dead stop because you're and then pretty soon your brain just like glosses over it, the C word. Okay, and then we go on, okay, here's an X word, here's a B word, and then you got 4 different long B words in the chapter. You're not going to be able to even recognize them later. So what I do is I expand the word list and not only have all of those key terms that I think the students are probably not going to be familiar with, or if they are, they're not very familiar with them. And, I've also recently expanded them even further, because look at all of the people using my books and are in my classroom who are struggling with the English to begin with. So they're already struggling with English. Now you're adding yet another language on top of that. And not only the people who are English language learners, but what about people who have various kinds of reading difficulties? What about people who are coming from a background where their vocabulary just really wasn't built up the way mine was when I reached that class? We have a question. Does somebody have the mic? Or are we even recording this? Oh, sorry.
So, hi.
Hi.
So, I actually am an elementary school teacher.
Yay, all
And,
right, cool. That's where the
and
real
so,
learning happens, right?
so, for vocabulary, which we teach at our school, is direct instruction. So, we do a visual, we do definition, and we do what's dance and vocab, and we also do flashcards. So,
Okay.
the kids will have at least minimum 75 reps of each word per week. So it may be 25 vocab words, and we actually teach Latin and Greek root words as well at our school.
Wow.
So we are already kind of moving
Yeah.
that wheel forward. So and I always tell them, when you leave 6th grade, they don't provide the flashcards for the students, but I
Yeah.
encourage them to make their own,
Right.
because
Yeah.
it's a recall.
Right. Yeah, I wish I went to your grade school, but we didn't do that. But I did learn actually in college to do that. An ecology professor, I was struggling. A couple of us where we went to his office, and he just smiled and pulled out his file drawer, and it was jam packed with index cards. And he said, "That's what you need to do." And so this is a good basis for students to make their own flashcards. They can, and I tell my students to do that, to make a flashcard for each one of those terms, and then start adding to it as you learn more and more about it. Yeah.
Kevin, you talked about adding audio to your books for certain things, but I think that if there was a way to add audio to the pronunciation of those words, you can't remember something you can't pronounce.
Yeah.
Also, the brain is very, very sensitive to sound,
Hmm.
and they remember sound better than they remember reading.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if there was a way to attach some audio to those
Yeah.
lists, it would be great.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, Margaret. And we didn't plan this ahead of time, did we? Okay, yeah. Uh, but that's an excellent idea. We do have audio glossary for each of our books. And the trick is it depends on the platform, and the platform that you use for a digital book, how that works. And with the big publishers, at least, they all want to use like these standard platforms that are like interchangeable. And they don't always have all the features you'd like to have. And then, of course, you got to get your publisher to pay for incorporating that feature, because somebody's got to go in and link all of those. Somebody's got to say them all, and that. But I do, and since you brought that up, and I'll come back to you in just. Oh, well, go ahead. You have another. She has a follow up here.
A follow-up on that is I send my students to translategoogle.com. And what's nice there is, particularly for the students where English is not their first language, you can put your word in, like neuron, and then you can pick a language, and they can hear it with the sounds of their own language. And then they can hear it in English, and they can make that bridge. So even if you can just link these words to something like that on the
so it's something
internet.
that's widely available. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great idea.
If I could interject, Kevin.
Sure.
A tool that I've used for the flashcard purposes that does have audio, but I don't know how it does with the words in your language, is Quizlet. So,
Oh, yeah,
and
right.
adds a lot of games and so forth to it as well.
Yeah, in Quizlet you can go in there and search for flashcards that have already been made for that textbook. So there's some from my textbooks that are already out there. I haven't noticed any, because I don't go out frequently looking for them, but I haven't noticed any yet that have the audio part of it. But I do, the next best thing you can do in a textbook, and I don't know if, I know this is fuzzy, but there is a pronunciation key next to each one of those. And it's a using regular letters, not all those diacritical marks you see in, like, Oxford English Dictionary and so on. So, hopefully that'll get people started. It is a little bit tricky, and probably this is true in any discipline. The keywords, there's more than one pronunciation that's acceptable. One of my friends, some of you probably know him because he usually comes, Ken Saladin, who's an A&P instructor. Also, he does a thing at our A&P conferences occasionally where it's called How Do You Pronounce It? And we go into the room, and here's people who have been teaching anatomy and physiology for years and years. Half of us are authors in the field. And he'll put up a term and put 5 different choices of what the correct pronunciation is. And we use our little clickers, and we click the right choice. And then he shows what's in the medical dictionary, and it's different than everybody picked. It's like the one that got 2 responses, everybody else, was a majority response. So that does happen, and so now you as a textbook author have to figure which one am I going to put in there, and secondly, maybe there's some that you're going to put more than one because they're so common. So, there are issues that come up, and there's some creativity that you need and decision-making you need as a textbook author to do that. And another thing we do, and it gets back to the comment that was made earlier about the flashcards, and that is, the word parts. And there is not a single anatomy and physiology professor I've ever met that didn't, at some point in our conversation, hint at least, the fact that they break down words like carbaminohemoglobin. Globin means a globular protein. Hemo means blood, or refers to a group that's on blood, an iron-containing group in blood. Amino is the part of the globin where carbon dioxide attaches, and that's where the carba comes from. So now you had a little A&P lesson there, but it's a whole sentence basically in Latin, and if you know those word parts, and so what we all do, I don't know, again, anybody that doesn't do this, we'll break them down and then just leave it at that. We just break down carbaminohemoglobin. Here it's easy to remember because it's got hemoglobin in it, carb, and you know about amino acids, and so they would have already known all that stuff. And now they can, in their mind's eye, they can put it all together, and hopefully that'll be a little memory hook for them. And then you do it again later and say, oh, look, here's another kind of hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin. What do you suppose is hooked to oxyhemoglobin? You guys know that, right? Oxygen. And so, you do that, and you don't stop and do a lesson on Greek and Latin. You're just throwing it out there. And if you do that enough times, there are a lot of recurring word parts that just keep coming up. So I thought, why not do that in the book? And then the students, hopefully they're picking up on that. And teachers aren't going to do that with every single term that comes up, just a handful of them. But if they're all there in the book, then the student can say, oh, I'll bet that means whatever. They can look and check and see that. And they can start to get used to, looking at things as a collection of word parts, as a phrase, rather than some long tongue-twisting term. Okay, so moving along here, we have this is just, can you read that? It's the eye test. No, this is the expanded word list over here. It's at the chapter opener. And when we run out of space, then we say, well, it's continued at the back of the chapter. It'll say continued on page 112 or whatever. In some of the books, we tried putting it all in the front, but then that becomes very intimidating. Like, oh my gosh, look at all these words I'm going to need to know in this chapter. But kind of get them started off and I'll get to another aspect of using those word lists in a minute. But I have a few more things I want to get to before we run out of time. Another, and this is kind of related to that, embedded directions. You know, how many times do students just not use those features that you work so hard to put in the book? And part of the reason is the teachers, they don't think about them either. And so they don't say, hey, make sure you look at those word lists because look at how they can be used. Look at their here and so on. So that's a hurdle to overcome. But a way around that is, you know, don't rely on the teacher to do that. Put the directions in yourself. So we have these little hint icons. And again, you can't read these, but every feature has a little hint that says, do I have the one for, the one for the word list, which I call language of science in some of the books. It's before reading the chapter, say each of these terms out loud. This will help you avoid stumbling over them as you read. So, you know, they have the pronunciation guide there. It tells them to say it out loud. It gets over that hurdle of learning a new language where they can hear it out loud. Now, if they can get to the audio glossary, too, which is online and separate, as Margaret pointed out, hearing that is also a big step in learning language. Let me go back here for just a second. So, you know, even the chapter summary, and it, you know, this one here tells them about the audio file that's available that I mentioned before, and different things. Even the questions. A lot of students say, like, look at the question, like, yeah, I can answer that one, I can answer that one. Well, that's familiarity, not mastery. They're not really learning much when they do that. But if you tell them, you know, this is only going to work if you write them out. You need to write out your answer, even if you weren't assigned to do that. So, you know, not all students are going to do it. I mean, how many of us read the directions for anything, really, right? But at least they're there. At least you've made the attempt to try and get students to do that. Another thing that I've tried that has worked surprisingly well, and that is, and this was, I did not use the method I described at the beginning of looking for the pain points and going to learning science and all that. It was because I wanted to put more stuff in the book but had a limited number of pages. So what am I going to do? And I noticed, man, I have all these sidebars. I have more and more. Pretty soon it's going to be all sidebars. And so, you know, I took some of them out, but I thought, you know, it's still kind of disrupting the flow a little bit. And these are interesting things, but not necessarily core ideas. So, hey, we have this thing called the internet now. We have online resources. Why don't I just take it out and put it there and then put a little link or a little reference to it and say, you know, here's something on the human microbiome. We don't have a chapter on it. And actually, I don't know how many of you know about the human microbiome, but right now your skin is just covered in microorganisms. Little tiny insects live in your eyelashes. Now your eyes are going to itch and so on. And all throughout your gut and your urinary tract, reproductive tract, on your eyeballs. There's an ecosystem on your eyeballs, and if it gets disrupted, you're prone to get an infection and so on. And we've known that for centuries, but we're just now learning all the interactions and how we cannot live a normal, healthy life until and unless our microbiomes in various areas of our body are healthy. And I thought, oh, I need to have a chapter on that. That's like a core understanding that we need for human anatomy and physiology these days. But where do I put it? Because it like touches everything. So I thought, I already have these online sidebar things. I'll do the human microbiome. And then once I got that idea, I thought, oh man, there's all kinds of other integrative things, integrative topics that really come up again and again and again and again in different areas. So now I can start to help students tie things together. Because isn't that hard? I mean, we have all these topics in a very logical sequence, but we can't be always saying, well, go back to chapter 3 and reread that because that's how, you know, that fits in here. I mean, we do some cross-referencing, of course, but it just becomes one giant cross-reference list if we do it completely. But if we have these articles that you refer to in 16 out of 48 chapters, because they're actually relevant, and then make sure your article is the kind of article that draws things together and shows them the bigger picture, then I think that becomes a pretty unique and very useful learning feature.
Thank you. Something I've noticed in my own teaching is that students have this weird thing. They don't read any of, I call these nibbly bits. And they don't read any of the nibbly bits. They just see text. So I teach them just relax your eyes and let what comes out show you what's important, because that's what the author wants you to see. So I love that you're telling us, point your students toward all these little nibbly bits, because for some reason they don't understand that that's the important stuff.
Right, right. And I think that's an excellent point. And another point that kind of refers back to what I was saying before is to get the teachers on board with that, because I think our tendency is, I think we were all pretty decent students. At least we got to be decent students at some point in our academic career. And so we kind of already know how to use a textbook. We kind of already know how to find help when we need it and so on. But that's not necessarily our typical reader. Our typical reader is going to need that kind of direction. And so I think the teachers aren't often pointing them there because we as educators just didn't need that as students. And it's really hard to get ourselves out of our own head and try to imagine what it's like in the heads of our students. And so I appreciate your pointing out that those hints that I was talking about before and these little asides that say, hey, let's stop and look at this other topic. There are ways that I can put in there. I can do part of that job of pointing students to where there are some things and why it's important. Like, that there are these online articles and you probably skipped them all, but hey, this one relates to what we're learning now, and this is a big breakthrough, or this is a recent trend, this is an emerging idea, and so on. Another thing is something I talked about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this time, but it was part of a talk I gave a few years ago where I had worked with some other people to develop a pretest, because I found that pretests in my own teaching made a huge difference in learning outcomes for my students. They oh my gosh, they did so much better on their test when I gave them a pretest before we started the topic and told them, just guess. I don't care what you put on there. You probably want to get a low grade, so just shoot from the hip and fill out the pretest. And then the regular tests start going way up. Why? Because they'd already been asked questions about it. So they knew the kinds of questions, not the exact questions, but they knew the kinds of questions I was going to ask. They knew what topics I was going to zero in on. They knew how I was going to ask them to apply this information. And now they could study knowing that information that they would have had no other way of knowing before. So I thought, how can I do that in a book? So I don't know if you noticed on that table of contents, but my 48 chapters are divided up into 6 units. And so each unit has a pretest in front of it. And it's actually doing a couple of things. One is it's previewing the material. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that they wouldn't have learned, but they're going to be learning in that unit. But I also ask a couple of questions that are things that I know they need to remember from a prior unit, and they're going to need to know that going into this unit, because it's going to be kind of the basis from which we start. And so it's kind of a refresher from that end of it. So that's part of the unit opener now. It's a full-page thing where they have these questions to answer, and then it has the answers. I don't know if you can see this, like in those magazine quizzes and so on along the side here, because I don't want them just guessing the wrong thing and hanging there, because then that might be what gets locked into their memory is the wrong answer. So I want them to check and see what the right answer is. So it's a pretest. Another thing, I was talking about sidebars. Here's a kind of sidebar that you might not think about. I don't have a good name for it. I call them stretch sidebars, because they're kind of stretching the theme of the sidebar and stretching it beyond my content area. So these sidebars, and they're in that book that's out on the table there, this is where we're doing a whole bunch of stuff that's not A&P. I'm looking at, well, what's the historical context? What's the history of this? What do scientists in this area that this chapter focuses on, what do they do and how do they do it? And why do you need to know this? What kind of careers need to know about cells? This is from a cell chapter. And it goes back and it talks about Ernest Everett Just, who was at one time a very well-known scientist. He kind of helped put the scientific method as we know it now on the map. I mean, it had been around for a while, but it was pretty sloppy and messy and not the way we know it today. And he kind of directed it in that direction. And he's the one that really started looking at living cells, doing experiments on living cells, not just dead cells on a slide. And he made a number of different breakthroughs. And so here was a good opportunity to highlight him. And not only that, but now we're looking at people who aren't traditionally talked about in the history of science. People who are minorities, women. I try to put as many women in there as well. People who weren't born in the United States, I try to put them in there as well. I try to have a very diverse group of people in there. So I'm adding this sort of social context of, look, all kinds of people can do science. All kinds of people have done science and made big breakthroughs. And, so here's what he did. Here's what it has to do with the cell. And, the study of cell is called cytology. And if you're going to get into oncology, cancer work, you need to know about cells. If you're going to get into pharmacology, a lot of my students are going to the St. Louis College of Pharmacy, or going to be, and they need to know about cells. Pharmacology is all about cells, the effects of drugs on cells. And so I'm introducing career options. And that's always a good thing, and especially for my A&P students who come in, I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to be a doctor. So one of the two. And then they get partway into it and think, oh, my gosh, I've done all this work in A&P, and I hate nursing. I took that first nursing, I hate it. What can I do? Well, now they've been stoked with all kinds of ideas about alternative careers that they can do. There's some pitfalls in using unusual features. One of them is the teachers may not value those new features and say, why would I want that in a textbook? I'm going to use this textbook because it looks like a textbook should look like. So you have to kind of overcome that. And then, of course, related to that is students may not know how to use them either. But we talked about using hints and so on to overcome that. A way to help with teachers is I have a blog for each one of my textbooks. And the teachers can go there, and the sales reps, I tell them about that. Direct the potential adopters or current adopters there. So this is for the big book here. So this is where I'm explaining the pretest, the idea behind it, the value behind it, and so on. So they can get an idea of why it's there. It's not just some other thing the students, nibbly bits that the students can skip over, that there's really some logic behind it and some value for students and so on. And that's the hint that I point out. Yep, there's a hint for this, and tells them why they need to do the pretest. And notice I promote TAA in my blog. Now this is home. We don't have enough time to do this, and I found out this morning that our wireless network here really wouldn't allow us to do it effectively anyway. But I have this Padlet. I don't know if you've ever used Padlet, but you can, if you go into that URL. So this is your homework assignment, to go in and start adding your own ideas. I mean, I put the 6 main ones that I focused on this time, but add to that. You just double click on here and it creates a new box. And you don't have to link it up to other ones, but if you want to, you can. Or you can go into the ones that are already there and further expound on other variations of it. So I welcome you to do that. So we have, 5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minutes left. And that's all I have as far as a presentation goes. So we have 5 minutes if anybody has any questions, or if you have another kind of feature that wasn't talked about. Yeah.
In addition to your embedded word lists, do you include a glossary, and how do you do indexing?
Yeah. It depends on the book how exactly I do the glossary, but I'm a big believer in glossaries because I think that that's where the student is going to go first. If they run across a term in a chapter later than the one where it was introduced, it's not going to be necessarily in that chapter's word list, and yet they're lost. And so where do they go? They can go to the glossary. And in the glossary, in the big book at least, I repeat the pronunciation guide and I repeat the word parts. Now in the smaller books, I I leave out the word parts. They have to go find them in a chapter. So, yeah.
One of the details from the Science of Teaching and Learning, which goes by the SOTL name, Scholarship
hear.
of Teaching
Oh,
and
yeah,
Learning,
right, yeah.
is something called the testing effect, in which they do experiments in which they find that students learn more by taking the test than by reading the book. They're
Yeah.
more sophisticated experiments, but that's one of the features that comes up. Also, a lot of the principles, I'm a game designer too, so a lot of the principles you're talking about are just fundamental to game design, even if it's not overtly a game.
I need a little Pac-Man thing to go through that. But I'm really glad you brought up the testing thing, because I'm a huge proponent of that. And as I said, I teach in a program where I'm mentoring other A&P students, and we just went through, I gave them a little online seminar on how I use testing as a way of teaching in my class, and I've built, over the years, built a really huge test bank, and it's randomized, and that's how they're doing it. They're doing all these online tests, and some of the people I'm working with who have never taught before, and even some of the ones who have, they're like freaking out, like, they can look in the book though. I'm like, yeah, okay, let them look in the book, let them consult with each other, because when they're doing that, I'm not seeing how they're coming out at the end. I have an exam for that. I'm trying to get them to learn it, and you learn it by testing. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really fundamental, in my book, in my mind, excuse me. I forget where I am. In my mind, in my mind, that is really a fundamental element of teaching and learning. Yeah.
Hey, so when you were talking about chunking, one of the thoughts that I had, and this has to do with the way students approach material and also with, I think, how learning works. When you've got 49 sections, if the students are taking the material from each of those one sections and putting it in, storing it in these set of neurons and these over here, how do you chunk but also create connections between the materials, which I think is equally valuable? And do you find that that gets sacrificed in chunking it in too small parts?
No, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I do get that question a lot from people when I'm discussing my book with them and they're unfamiliar with it, and they'll say, yeah, but I want to integrate, like nervous system, I have all those chapters, I want to teach it in an integrated way. But you can't talk about everything in the same sentence. You have to chunk it at some point. You have to do that. So if I have, I don't know, let's say 12 subsections in a long chapter, what difference is it if I take 6 of those and put them here and the other 6 and put them here, and they're still, tail to end or tail to mouth or whatever there. So it's still, in the same sequence. And so I see what you're saying, but another thing I do is what I consider my secret ingredient that I'm revealing to you now, and probably recorded for posterity, and that is I look at it like telling a story. Everything is telling a story. If you use storytelling principles in your teaching and don't write that down. That's a secret. But, and you can't copyright ideas, can you? That's, I think you could. But okay, yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Kevin. Extremely informative. I'm curious, when you have an idea for a new feature, what's the relationship or communication with the publisher as to if you get the green light to be able to do it?
Well, I mean, it's my book, so I mean, that's my position, is that it's my book, and I've always had a good relationship with my editors and my publisher, and I cultivate that. Not that it needs a lot of cultivation, because I've had good people to work with, but I always bring it to them first and say, like with that pretest thing. Before it was barely an idea in my head, I talked to my editor about it. Because a lot of times she's had experience with other books and so on where they've done similar things. Say, yeah, we tried that in this other book, in this nursing book, and it just sank right away, and here's why. And I think, well, okay, let's see if we can make it float, And so, yeah, I do, I discuss it with them. But they leave it up to me as the content expert and the pedagogy expert to do that. Now, where there is a potential for some conflict is if I say, okay, I'm going to need, 32 more pages in my book in order to do this, then it's like, sorry, you need to take something out and do that. So that's where, that's what they're more concerned about because that's what their job is. I'm more the content guy. But I always go outside and ask like reviewers, I ask friends, I sometimes hire a consultant and so on to talk through this with and work it that way. So.
There's one final question, and that'll
Okay,
be
I
the
one
last.
final
I
question.
get the last. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I teach courses in learning and memory and everything else. And one of the most interesting things that I've learned I've self-created a metacognition course, which is part of a lot of different majors and minors and things. And we do, and why I'm here is because I'm trying to create my own textbook with all of the ancillaries and everything. But what I found, and I have longitudinal data across 5 years, so I have thousands of students, non-majors, majors, and we do this testing effect where we look at pre-test, post-test, and we look at self-awareness and in the course we're doing all the things that you're saying. Where the biggest impact that the students tell me, so I compare students in my metacognition course with students in a cognition course where they just learn about the content but they don't have the application. In metacognition, we do self-assessments for every single topic that we talk about, and the students will say, I don't remember anything from the textbook, but I do remember my results on that self-assessment, and it showed, I like visual stuff, or I learn best this way, or I need to chunk my time this way. And so I see that as being relevant to any content area for students to know about be aware of their own learning and what benefits them. And it all goes back to that, the science of learning and SOTL and all of that stuff. So I think I'm right on par with what you're saying, and that's why I want to learn more about creating ancillaries and creating textbooks that incorporate all of that, whether it's print or whether it's digital or whether it's online or, all those different platforms. So this is like confirming to me. It's very interesting stuff, and I hope, whatever I create would also share the same findings.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, great, thank you. Yeah. That's a great ending comment. Wow, that just kind of wraps it all
Hey,
up. So.
thank you, Kevin.